Hey everyone, Dan Eizans here, and today I've got the pleasure of getting to talk to you about Relationality, an emergent politics of life beyond the human by Arturo Escobar, Mikhail Osterweil, and Kriti Sharma. I'm actually really glad I chose the book because while it was a little bit heavy and a bit of a heady read, there was a lot that I liked about the book, and a lot of it actually applied to how I thought about our Design Futures project on the future of truth and misinformation. It's pretty dense with history and tackles the topic of relationality, which I didn't have a ton of context about before I started reading it, outside of some of the parallels that that concept has to Buddhism and the concept of inner being is a foundational principle of thought and study in that area. The authors have a lot of great case studies. They cover everything from religious context to the struggles of prison abolitionists, the civil rights movement, and relational ways of life that have kind of emerged from Latin America, where there's a pretty heavy influence in this book, kind of like the one that Andy picked. I definitely don't regret picking it, and I'll get into some of more of the reasons why as we jump into some of the slides. The authors, pretty diverse disciplinary backgrounds, anthropology, global studies, and biology to explore design relationality, which for them means creating with an awareness that we are in an intrexable relationship with one another, with the earth, with non-human things that are all part of our world. Escobar is a professor emeritus of anthropology at UNC Chapel Hill, focusing on political ecology, design, and decolonial theory. Osterweil is a teaching associate professor with social movements and knowledge production, and Kriti Sharma is a postdoctoral scholar in microbial ecology at Caltech. Really thinking about where biology, philosophy, and social science all kind of meet. Their different perspectives are definitely present in the book. It goes around interdependence beyond human-centric views of how we need to think about a new ontological approach to design and living our design in future of working together. They share a view that something is wrong with the world, that our collective future is kind of at risk, and that we're sort of at this tipping point. They cite things like existential dread and fear of the future as being more common, and that we're being defutured. So Tony Fry's work is referenced quite a bit here as well. I know somebody else in class picked that book. I think it was Andy. And as the world rushes to sort of secure the short-term future under capitalist systems, it erodes the possibility of a long-term future for all, the planet included. So the authors have kind of a very Terra-centric approach in this book, and it's pretty present throughout most of the stories and threads. Um, I think the intent that they have behind the book is first to just offer a primer and an approach of sort of unlocking relationality and how everything is sort of dependent on one another. We can kind of see this mycelial colony here I've used to sort of illustrate that point. They argue that the root of our contemporary crisis of climate, energy, food, inequality, and the meaning of life itself is sort of rooted in this idea of dualism, where um, we have to we're really more individual and just in this bigger part of the movement, and that is sort of holding us back. That they highlight the movements and fixes that failed that could have benefited from relational thinking and design over time. There's a lot of movements that they note from the Occupy Wall Street movement to Black Lives Matter, the anti-globalist movements of the late 1990s and early 2000s, before they kind of get into their framework at the end, which I think is the fourth intent, a framework for sort of bridging, designing, and living to move from a dualist universe to one that's more pluriversal, that relational approach. They have kind of an instructive account of the philosophical, scientific, social, and political sources of relational theory and action. But what they don't necessarily do is really give you sort of an instruction manual on how to get started. It's a lot of theory, but they have some thought on how to transition from living with what they are calling toxic loops, and that are kind of based on ontological dualism to living within what they call relational weaves, which they would call on all of us to co-create with multiple humans, thinking about the natural world and impacts and the non-human elements that would help sort of design a more um, not I want not egalitarian, but a more hopeful future for all. The book's structured in kind of three main parts. Part one is Remember, which is describing the dominant dualist story of life and sort of how we got to where we are today. They uncover the story of the dominant modern worldview that separates, objectifies, and sort of isolates us all. They explore how Western science and philosophy have actively produced non-relationality just by design. Going all the way back to Darwin and then coming back to today, how these sort of modes have sort of cemented this dualist, non-relational approach. It also reclaims alternative biographies or biographies or ways of being that are sort of grounded in interconnection. And they kind of use that as a story arc to talk about how the story that we're in today just doesn't work anymore in their view. And remembering the ones that have always existed kind of in the outside fringes and margins, they use this kind of first section to say there's a better way. Part two is called Choose. This section of the book is really to acknowledge the ontological slippages that allow us to begin to maybe act a little more relationally. This is where some of those stories come in, like the Zapatistas, Black Lives Matter, the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s, where we kind of really start to lean into the politics of our storytelling and how relationality can be activated as more of a political force. Here, our authors are exploring the tensions, risks, and ethical responsibilities involved in moving away from this sort of dominant paradigm and the struggles that it takes to get there, right? They say that there's these little hallucinations or portals that move us towards relationality, but that choosing it isn't just this one-time decision, right? And we sort of see how some of these movements like Occupy Wall Street may have started from a place of relationality, but then kind of filter out as we kind of move back to our dualist tropes. Section two is really the pivot point. It's sort of the call to awareness and agency that we're already in a moment of transition and we have to act now if we want to do the right thing, or in the author's mind, do the right thing and respond. The last part is called Remake. It offers us a vision for designing and living more relationally towards a pluriversal future. Exposes things like sacred activism, autonomy, and abolition, like the prison abolition movement, as a bridge for sort of remaking life and rethinking about how we approach our future. And it ends with the idea that to design is to story life in a different way. So the authors are calling for us to sort of restory ourselves, to not necessarily ignore things like spirituality. Especially they're especially complimentary and thoughtful about women's movements, communities of color, indigenous folks, and those histories and how where relationality becomes more generative. It's no longer a critique, but a practice, an invitation to live, make, and relate to people differently. So, what does relationality really mean for the authors? They don't necessarily give us a very specific definition for relationality. I think the takeaway that I have here on the slide is sort of a good synopsis of what they're trying to say. But relationality for them isn't just a value. It's a worldview and a political orientation. I think that's why we're calling the book An Emergent Politics of Life Beyond the Human. Definitely it kind of comes off that way in the way that as you get through the chapters. It embraces the idea that our identities, experiences, and possibilities are shaped with and through others, including things that are non-human. So our connection to the earth, ecology, technology that we're creating, and social systems themselves are also incredibly important in thinking about relationality as a bigger topic. And the implication being that politics and knowledge making have to begin from connection rather than separation. So moving past this idea of defuturing ourselves through by separating ourselves from the rest of the world around us. The authors are kind of contending that the key to constructing a livable world lies in the cultivation of ways of knowing and acting based on an awareness of the fundamental interdependence, of everything that exists. So that's what they're really referring to as relationality. So we have to have that shift in the paradigm to heal our bodies, our ecosystem, the cities, and the planet at large. So not just that philosophy, really a worldview. So some of the key concepts that I sort of took away from all this, modernity is sort of broken. That if we think of our entire lives as a story, it's a broken one. The root cause of climate, political, existential crises is separation and defuturing. That design is truly life making. It is not limited to professionals. It is an everyday act of relational care and world making, drawing from indigenous thought, feminism, systems biology, and design theory. Um, that really the key messages that they're trying to go here is that we need this new story to live by. So their critique on how modernity creates the toxic loops is really meant to pull us away from that, that we can come out of some of these crises if we stop thinking about design as a technical fix and thinking about it more as how we make life itself. So if we have that shift, everyday acts like cooking, organizing, storytelling are all part of how we design our lives. A couple more here. Non-relationality is produced, right? So capitalism and colonialism didn't just destroy systems, they actively created a non-relational worldview. That primitive accumulation and market logic are not natural, they're engineered. And that relationality on the other side of things is emergent and pluriversal. So if we don't return to one past or more of a utopia, we co-create futures rooted in diverse ontologies, which is going to have to be the pluriverse. If we don't take that view, we're going to continue to reinforce the dominant system, and that we are already seeing relationality in pockets. It just hasn't been well distributed. It's not something that's a distant goal. It's something that's already practiced in the Zapatistas, through indigenous communities, feminists, and different social movements. The book is not really prescriptive here. It emphasizes pluralism and warns against turning relationality into something that's more of a rigid ideology, which would, again, just be another way of reinforcing bad patterns. But rather, it's calling for us to design in a way that allows many worlds to coexist together and be cognizant of each other. Um, they also covered a lot of these cases. I'm not going to spend too much time in this section, but this was one of my favorite parts of the book was that there's really rich connection to history, cases, and examples. They lean heavily into the Zapatistas and their concept of kulai. I'm probably butchering that, or life in plenitude. Right. So this was where the Occupies movement refusal to make demands in capitalist terms. And then Black Lives Matter, their focus on ontological transformation rather than just legal reform. All of those instances are relational politics in action. They demonstrate what designing relationality could start to look like, but didn't necessarily have like that broader seed to really take full foot. So those were some of the ones that really stuck out to me as I was reading through the book there. And then when we finally get to their framework, they have these principles for activating on relational design. Again, not necessarily a real instruction manual. These are definitely more theoretical. But they identify these five core principles that sort of underline what a new politics of relationality might look like. That it has to be contingent and local. That emergence, complexity, and wholeness are really part of what needs to be created. It's nonlinear, it's dynamic, and it can't be broken down into simple parts and solutions. The excess, paradox, and difference that reality exceeds categories. Relational life has to embrace contradiction and the unknown. That it can be non-normative, that ethical life is not about conforming to these fixed ideals, but practicing awareness is beyond the binary notions of what's good and what's bad. And then at the end of the day, love and spirituality is really important to designing a new way forward. Agreements. I really liked the critique on extractive capitalism and ontological dualism. I think there's a lot to that. I thought the work resonated a lot with futures thinking, systems thinking, and design practice. I certainly looked at our project on the future of truth in this aspect quite a bit. I found that it had a lot of nods to some of the transformation and collapse scenarios that we were looking at. And I saw how those systems were really kind of rooted in capitalism and dualist thinking. So it definitely got my mind going when I thought about our design project. But there were also some things that I didn't love about the book. I really enjoyed it, but it gets pretty dense. For me, it's definitely more of a book on theory at this point, and not necessarily something that is sort of a manual or actionable like some of my classmates got to have in their books. It's lacking some actionable strategies for policymakers, designers, leaning heavily into personal interpretations of the framework instead. And it risks some ambiguity when everything becomes relational. So for that, it was sort of for me, it just needed a little bit more um, application rather than just theory. And it does feel a little inaccessible at times. It is super poetic and super powerful, but it's also a little bit abstract. So if you don't necessarily get down on the theory and are looking for something like what can I do with this, you might be left a tiny bit disappointed. But in conclusion, I really thought it was a great book. I enjoyed it immensely. It asks us to radically kind of reimagine how we relate to ourselves, to each other, and to the more than human world. It's about adding connection to existing structures, and it basically puts the power of design in everyone's hands. If they can move outside of their dualist ontological view, they're emphasizing sort of that the crises we face, like ecological collapse, inequality, social fragmentation, are not isolated or accidental. That these are here because they're symptoms of a dominant ontology that's rooted in separation, individualism, and dualism. And in contrast, relationality offers an emergent politics that sort of creates co-becoming and care. And a lot of the stuff that we learned about in this class, it tries to break those old rules of design to a specific product. But I really liked the book and highly recommend it as a good read. Um, just a couple of references that they had in future reading, things that it connects to really well. Obviously, Barry's The New Story, Fry's Defuturing, Winter's Human Being as Praxis, and As We Have Always Done by Simpson are all really big references in this book. And they're definitely good further reads and already on my reading list now to kind of round out my thoughts and my knowledge of relationality. Thanks a lot, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed the book and definitely recommend the read, especially if you're reading Defuturing and some of those other books. Have a good one.